The latest exhibit at the University of Winnipeg's Gallery 1C03 is an act of reclamation and decolonization. Reclaimed Indo-Caribbean HerStories is the work of Indo-Caribbean artist Heidi McKenzie, and it tells the story of Indo-indentureship from the mid-19th to early 20th centuries through a feminist lens. Through mixed media and ceramic-based pieces, McKenzie highlights the little-known stories of the women who made a perilous journey across the ocean and performed hard labor that have rarely been examined. McKenzie joins us from her studio in Toronto to tell us more about reclaimed Indo-Caribbean HerStories. Hello, Heidi, and welcome here.
Hi, Nolan. Great to be here with you.
So, first of all, love the title. We're going to get into why you chose that in maybe just a little bit. But maybe to back up to start, what did you know about the experiences of these women going into this project?
Going into the project, what did I know about the? So I guess I knew really nothing about the contemporary women. I just decided I wanted to shed light on 10 contemporary living Indo-Caribbean women. Quite literally, I'd always wanted to do a project with light boxes and porcelain. And so this was a great opportunity to do it. But in terms of the women historically placed, I had been, my whole world changed about 13 years ago when my cousin came back from Trinidad with a photograph of my great-great-grandmother. She looks really old in the photograph, and on the back of the photograph, it said she lived to be 105. And she,
Wow.
in fact, was the woman who came from Calcutta to Guyana on my father's paternal ancestral line. And I just was mesmerized. And then I started reading, and I started, attending events by Caribbean academics, and I started talking to people, and I started just did a really, really deep dive. And do you want me to tell you what I found out? I'm not sure where
I
you want.
do. I do. I would love to hear all the things that you found out about these stories.
Okay, we don't have time for all the things, but some of the highlights would be, first of all, I assumed my ancestors came as a family, as couples, but in fact, all the women came alone. And there were very few women because they really didn't need that many women. They wanted hard labor to replace the slaves. So this was right after Britain abolished slavery in their colonies, which was in the 1830s, and they need labor force to work the plantations, largely sugar plantations, some cocoa, some coffee, some pineapple in Jamaica, and various other crops, cash crops. And so I found out that these women came by themselves. Some of them were widows. Some of them were shunned by their families, which can be the same thing. Some of them had come up against really hard times, had ended up in prostitution. All of them were illiterate, pretty much. And they came not knowing what they were coming for, marked their ex on a contract to work for 5 years, hard labor. And at the end of 5 years, they were promised a piece of land for themselves to farm or to work another 5 years and return home. About 20% returned home, and most stayed and thrived. And the women were able to come to Trinidad and literally cast off caste, which was a very real thing in India. So there was a leveling effect. And they were able to get beyond the cultural norms of, for example, being burned alive at the pyre if you were a widow. So there were some great advantages for the women in the Caribbean, and that they were really, a force in the sense that they were survivors, and they figured out how to navigate the system very quickly. They couldn't access the banking systems because they were illiterate, and they were being paid 2, 3, 4, 5 silver shillings if they cut 2 tons of cane a day. And so they didn't have a place to hold their earnings or their wealth. And we're not talking about serious wealth. These are people who inhabited the dirt floor huts of the slaves. In fact, many academics are now calling the Indo-indentured workers the new slaves. However, so back to my point, they eventually silversmiths came from India to the West Indies as well, and they had them fashion their earnings into jewelry, which they wore on their body in the fields. And this was something they had. They could kind of pawn it when they needed funds. They could wear it and own it, and it became the jewelry, which is very much a part of this exhibition, became really a symbol of resistance and power and courage of the women.
There's so much in all of that to unpack, and there's so much rich history within that to dive into. I'm wondering, as I look behind you at all of the beautiful ceramic pieces in your studio, what is it about ceramics as a medium that captures these experiences, these HerStories, and brings them alive for viewers that come and see Reclaimed?
That's a great question. Well, I mean, ceramics captured me, my life about 17 years ago, and I couldn't look back. But one of the things that I love about ceramics is the possibility of the translucence of porcelain, and this is a porcelain tile, which has some translucency, which you may or may not be able to see, and so, you know, I do abstract minimalism, modern minimalism, and some of the works in the show are in that genre. But on the other polarity, I use photography, and I use a lot of archival photography on ceramics. And so on porcelain, there's a possibility to illuminate the stories, the photographic historic stories, and the contemporary portraits of women. And I have done that using LED lighting for a couple of the installations in that show. The other thing about ceramics is it's one of our oldest mediums. It's very tactile. It's very haptic. It's very process oriented in the creation of a thing, and it's also limitless. But at the same time, it's I could drop this on the floor and it will smash into 1,000 pieces. So there's that tension of the fragility and permanence as well.
You mentioned the other big element within this exhibit being the photography. And as I was scrolling through the photography on display, I was struck by there was almost a museum quality to the images, as though it was almost anthropological in a sense. And I wondered if part of the reclamation that you were talking about brings these stories to life, as you just demonstrated, as well onto the ceramics. Was that part of the calculus behind the mixed media approach to this exhibit?
Well, when you say anthropological, there's a whole ethnographic, I was reading a lot also about photography as I was discovering and researching and finding these archival images. I'm shout out to Amar Wahab, who's a prof here at York University. And I went to a talk, his book launch, and then we got talking, and he lent me a huge ring binder that he had of Caribbean postcards, historic Caribbean postcards, many of which had these images of the coolie bells. And so, gosh, I'm not even remembering what the question is. I'm just telling you about the photography.
Not at all. I mean, I guess maybe to put it another way, it feels like the mixed media approach just adds another dimension of humanity, as opposed to merely documenting these women as laborers in the field.
Yes. So there's a couple of things I want to say about the photographs of documenting the women. They weren't documented as laborers in the field. They were plucked out of the field by Western photographers, staged with backdrops and photographed. And their identities were stripped from them. They were called Hindu type, coolie woman, Indian worker. And they were used in postcards to attract Western tourists. In other words, there was an extreme exoticization and objectification of these women. Not all of them, but the ones who posed for these cards. So that has classically been called the coolie belle, and coolie is a negative, a derogatory term. In fact, it is in many circles equivalent to the word Negro in the Indian community. So, this is that's particularly the series of what look to be like lanterns I call illuminated, where I'm literally shedding light on these women, and those are all the coolie belle postcards. But the other thing I wanted to say about ceramics and our photography and mixed media is that last week I was at a conference for ceramics from people coming, I think there were 6,000 practitioners from all over the world. And somebody said to me, oh, I love what you do with photography on ceramics because they're so much alike. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, they both freeze time. Ceramics freezes time and photography freezes time. And I just thought, wow, that is so profound and so true. So yes, those are kind of the things.
It's to speak about even more about the power of photography. You talk about the multi-generational portrayals that also exist within this exhibit. How common are experiences like yours where you find a descendant across generations who this is part of their family story, and then they are now having this same journey of discovery that you've been on since you first saw that image of your ancestor all those 13 years ago?
Well, I have to again give a shout out to Gayatri Bahadur, who wrote the book Coolie Woman. That was an incredible, eye-opening read for me, and she's an academic in New York. And her great-great-grandmother, reading her story was, and in great detail, was an awful lot like reading mine. I don't think it's very common that people have access to the images and stories of their ancestors who came from the ship. In fact, the history of indentureship was erased for 100 years virtually in Trinidad, where my father grew up, because the Canadian Presbyterian mission controlled the school system from 1868 to 1968. So people didn't learn about it. My father didn't know about indentureship until after he retired and had time to really look at it, for example. And when I found the 10 women who are in Holding Ancestry, only one other woman had an image of an ancestor that went back to that date. So I don't think it's common. I'm really lucky. And the other thing is, what's been happening to me through this sort of reclaiming of my history and my ancestors, and I also place myself. And the other thing to note is there is a third multimedia kind of aspect to this exhibition, is that the women, the contemporary women holding their female ancestors, like literally I photographed everybody. They got to choose what they wore, where they were, the photograph of who they wanted to hold, and tell the story they wanted to tell, and place themselves in the diaspora. So that is the reclamation that was taken away from them during colonial times. So through sharing my story and it getting out there, one of my cousins is in the show. I didn't know about her until 30 years ago or more. My husband took me to a party of West Indian literary folks, and we were talking, and I'm like, gee, your Uncle Harvey sounds a lot like my Uncle Harvey. No, Horace. My Uncle Horace sounds a lot like your Uncle Horace. And we were cousins, and we have been friends ever since. And Ramabai Espinay is a well-known novelist, poet, essayist, and academic. And I recommend her book, Swinging Bridge. I'm doing all these plugs. And then so she brought her sisters and family to the show. I met all these new cousins. And then we did a panel discussion, and she said, the expert on Indo-indentured jewelry is a cousin of yours. I said, no, you're kidding. We invited her up from New York to do the panel, whole new set of cousins from that side. And then a month after the show opened, I got an email saying, this might seem a little out of the blue, but I was just visiting from Philadelphia with my wife on a conference. I happened to go to the Gardner Museum. I saw your stuff. I think I'm your first cousin. And it turns out that my father was the eldest of a Brady Bunch split family, and his biological mother left the relationship and was estranged from him, pregnant. And this guy was the son of that baby that was in her womb. And then this morning, I'm not kidding, this morning I got an email from someone saying, hey, I saw this article in Guyana that you wrote about your show, and I think I'm your cousin. So my name is Heidi McKenzie, and it's McKenzie because my great-grandfather rejected Jadoo Rashidin and took James McKenzie. And this person who had contacted me this morning is from the Muslim side of the family. So I'm just like, this is crazy. Yeah.
What an incredible journey this has set you up on. Audiences can take in that journey at Gallery 1CO3. And I understand, just before we let you go here, there's also a guided tour and a talk taking place this week as part of the gallery on April the 1st. What sorts of things can people expect from that they might not otherwise get if they were just turning up at the gallery?
So I believe that is an event about sharing stories, and people will be sharing stories. I won't be there in person. Jennifer Gibson, who's the curator, will be there, and Emma Alexander, who is an incredible wealth of knowledge at the University of Winnipeg on Indo-indentureship, will be there, and you'll hear all kinds of stories and hear all kinds of other people who are invited to come and tell their stories.
Incredible. Where do you think this story, this reclaimed story of yours, will take you next? In other words, what is the next sort of creative engagement that you're already thinking of as you continue to fill in your her story, if you will?
Well, it's kind of a little bit tangential, but again, spins back to my father. There were the largest race protests in Canada were in Montreal in 1969. I didn't know about them. And as I was speaking with my mother shortly before she passed and telling her about what I was working on, she said, oh, of course, there's the time your father testified for that white guy in the race riots. I was like, what? And so I am looking at allyship, and literally just took this out of the kiln this morning. I'm looking at the community, the Black community of Trinidadians who really changed the landscape for Black rights in Canada, and were really literally pushed into the corners through violence and academic racism. So I'm looking at the role of kind of the nuance of and complexity of race and friendship and allyship. It's going to be a lot. It's for Montreal.
But it's so exciting nonetheless. We could, I think, talk about this all day. For now, Heidi McKenzie, thank you so much for joining us here on Classic 107 and telling us more about this incredible exhibit at Gallery 1CO3.
Thank you so much for having me.